This is Who Am I? And this is a show where we're going to interview top hackers from around the space. My name is Kirk Treichel, and today I have Justin Elze with me. Am I saying that right, too, by the way? I should have
Yeah,
asked you before.
LZ, just drop the E's. It's easy. Everybody knows it.
LZ.
That's why I'm
Okay.
asking LZ on Twitter, just because it's easier. That's how most people call me and how they write it.
Okay, cool. So LZ. All right, got it. Um, yeah, and so you are currently CTO at TrustedSec. And you're pretty well known in the community but for people who are not already aware, do you just want to first tell people what you do now, and then we can kind of get into your background?
Yeah. So currently, I am the CTO at TrustedSec. What that means for the hacker side of that is I'm over the research team, the red team, and the purple team here. So some of the advanced testing stuff we do, and then the R&D side, which is a lot of like implant design, EDR evasion, just stuff that keeps the offensive teams operating from day to day.
Yeah, and I am familiar with some of that work. You put out a cough loader based on the Cobalt Strike beacon object file loader, right?
Yep.
And then that cough loader, there's a Rust port, lesser known, called Coffee, that is based directly off of the TrustedSec cough loader. And then my cough loader is based on that. So it's like a few steps removed, but it all comes back to that TrustedSec cough loader. So first of all, I appreciate that work being shared. That was, I think, great for the red team community. But I think that's a good example of some of the kind of tooling that you work on in that area and put out, right?
Yeah, that's a good example, because that was like a side project of one of the research guys, Kevin Hubris. He's a genius. He was like, I don't really, like we should. He was doing some cough stuff before it was popular in Cobalt Strike, and he was like, I should just write this to test some tools out. So he wrote it. He's like, nobody's going to care about this. Like, this is dumb. I'm going to write a quick blog. Like, and like for a few weeks, nobody really cared. And then I was like, you guys can run like BOFs and just take this into any implant framework you want and use it. People were like, oh, that's kind of neat. And then it started popping up like in other people's tools. But the first like few months, he was like, see, nobody really cares. Just a side project. I was like, just wait. Like, people will realize the power of this. I think it was during a time where everybody was writing things in .NET. So there was like this weird transition from like, execute assembly to, well, BOF is probably the future in some ways. And I think people are making that transition mentally during that time, kind of figured it out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I was already kind of focused specifically on BOFs and object files, and had moved away from my .NET tooling already. So for me, when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is great. And then I wanted to implement it into my own framework for a long time, but it wasn't, I had to port it to Rust, and I went through a few different attempts and variations. And then, like I said, eventually somebody put out Coffee, and then I went from there. So yeah, that's a really cool tool. That release, and I know it's been helpful for me, and people should definitely check it out. So that gives people an idea of what you're doing now. Some really cool work. So one of the things that I always want to get into here is getting into your background, specifically, how and why, I guess, you became a hacker. And I like the term hacker. I still use the term hacker. I feel like it doesn't get tossed around as much anymore. Nowadays, everybody is like, I'm a red teamer, pen tester. And yeah, I mean, okay. But for me, like hacker, it's more than a job. It's not the job. It's something else. And so that's why I still like the term, right? Hacker, because it's not talking about a specific job. And that's kind of the part that I wanted to ask you about. Is like, how did you become a hacker?
Yeah, so that's like I think there's like a two-part story to this. There's like my InfoSec career and my hacking career. So I'd probably divide those. So I got into computers when I was younger. Like, I had an Apple IIe computer, and then I got a Macintosh Performa of 575, like really slow old machine. And I think this is really stupid, but like at the time, like you could load an encyclopedia and like pull up a map and like get all this information like instantly. And I know that I'm dating myself here, but like being able to do that at the time, like, hey, here's a map. Let me zoom in on this country where there's like a war happening or whatever, and like see topographical maps and see information was like pretty profound. Like before you have to pick up an encyclopedia, go to the library, that sort of thing. So that's what started. And then I just think from there, like I always like taking apart electronics and just kind of breaking things. So I was in like the whole AOL, like tools, mass mailing scene thing for a while. And then I kind of got into like BBSs. And at one point I talked my family into like, hey, I want to get a PPP account to do dial up. And I was like, we don't need AOL. Like, we're going to do this. And they were like, why? Like, what is this? Like, we have AOL. It's the same thing. So somehow I talked them into that. And then from there, I just kind of found IRC. And, there was a pretty big scene back then, like between like channel takeovers and denial of service stuff. And just like hacking in general was different. Like, if you look at attrition and some of those sites now, like in the past life, those were like web defacements and things like that. And now, like web defacing really isn't a thing, and hacking to learn is less of a thing. I think there was more of a gray area back then than there was now. So that's kind of where I got into things. I was, I did some computer stuff in like high school, and I took a Cisco Net Academy. So I did really poorly in high school because I didn't show up, but I didn't do anything. However, I got wasn't a,
So this is a trend already.
Yeah.
You're the third guest. And every single person so far has said, I didn't really do well in high school. I didn't show up. I didn't care. Sorry. I just think it's so funny that it's a trend already. But
my family was really against like Cisco Net Academy because at the time, like this is New York State specific, but there was like a Regents diploma and a local diploma. And if I did the Cisco Net Academy, I only got a local diploma. My parents were like, no, like this is bad. And my guidance counselor and some teachers I'm still really close with were like, no, this is a better path for him. So I went and did that Cisco Net Academy. I was like first in my class. Like it was the one class I did really well on. And I just remember like winning awards and stuff for that. But then like people were like, you're failing everything else. So I did that. And then I went to, and I'll add this part, because I failed gym in a bunch of classes. I graduated high school in about 5 years, which was poor life planning at the time. But like I that's why I try not to, like, everybody learns from their mistakes. So then I went to college for a semester in Texas. It was one of the only like computer security programs at the time. So I did a semester there and realized like I knew more than the class, but like this wasn't for me again. Like I still hadn't flipped the switch about like learning in life. So there's like, that was like the beginning half of my career, just kind of the hacker side of it. And then after that, I kind of came back from Texas to New York, worked at a car dealership. I washed cars, stuff like that. How I actually got my first computer job was interesting. I was dating my now wife. Her dad worked in an HVAC, so heating and cooling place. And he's like, you should come work with me. Like, computers, like everything's going computer controlled. So I was like, hey, whatever. Like, I'm not doing anything useful now. Interviewed with the owner of that company, and he was like, hey, you're too smart for this. Why don't you go work at this computer repair shop my friend owns? And I was like, right, but you're going to pay me twice the money to start that this computer repair shop's going to pay. Like, I was like, whatever. I was like, I'll go do the computer repair. So I started doing like front desk. You drop off your computer, I fix it, basic stuff.
That's hilarious. I did that exact same thing myself. I worked at a small time computer repair shop. It was called RLT Computers. It was owned by my uncle, and he just needed a hand, and it was same thing. So,
and one day they were like, our squirrel mail and Qmail server broke and they couldn't fix it or something like that. And I was like, hey, I know Linux. They're like, what do you mean you know Linux? And I was like, well, I've been doing Linux since I was like 10, 11. I was like, I can fix this. So that kind of got me spun up. They had a development team and things there. So I kind of just, moved up the ranks there until I couldn't do anything. And then some system admin, network engineer jobs, and, kind of made my way into InfoSec, which wasn't easy either. So.
Yeah. So how did you, okay. So you already had a background in hacking. You talked about you were part of the AOL, IRC, BBS scene and everything. And I was going to ask, how you kind of made the transition once you were working in repair and system admin and stuff. But I guess before I get to that, when you were young and you were just messing around on AOL and stuff like that, Did you ever get in any trouble? Any real trouble? Did you ever get yourself in trouble with any of that activity?
No, no, I never got in trouble. People adjacent to me got in some trouble. Um, it it's funny. So I have a side story here that is relevant. So I worked as a DoD contractor for a long time, and whatever that means. Well, not a long time, for like a period of time in my many systems engineer jobs. So I did some Mac integration for the DoD. So background checks and all the associated things with that, no problem.
Yeah.
Years later, I tried to join InfraGard, and I applied and didn't hear anything. And for those of you who don't know what InfraGard is, it's like a information sharing program between the US, FBI, and private sector. So I didn't hear anything. And then I applied again, and they sent me a letter. It was like, you're denied, but you can challenge this. So I was like, okay, whatever, like we can come out. So they came out and they were like, hey, what do you do now? I'm like, well, I've been working in security for years. I was like, you guys did my background check for some other things. Like, we've talked before. They're like, oh, well, we denied you because you're associated with some IRC stuff from like years ago. And I was like, okay. I was 12. I'm like, but I've had extensive background checks since that time. Not a mention. But I tried to join InfraGard and they bounced it. And they were like, oh. So I talked to them. They're like, oh, okay, cool. Like, we just have to follow up. Like, it was just to check like a whatever required thing. So after that, they're like, okay, you're in InfraGard, no problem. Have a great day. And I was like, I'm glad you guys are information sharing with yourselves. So I was like, it was just a really weird scenario because I was like, it had never come up before. And I've had like all of the security jobs have had background checks, like everything, and like really deep ones too. So just never came up. And then after that, I was like InfraGard, and they have pictures of me when I Hack Charities used to be a big thing. So they have pictures of me with like them and that shirt and just stuff like that. And we've had a good partnership since then, like just information sharing about like what's going on and things like that. But that was just a weird speed bump in the mix that I did not expect.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I ran into some similar stuff when I did work for the DoD. My stuff came up when I did work for the DoD during my security reviews. Same thing though. I didn't really get in trouble, but I had people I knew close to me that like got into carding and got themselves busted one way or another, right? So
that's a funny one.
You're associated with these guys that did this thing, So
so this is really adjacent, but in middle school, I had friends. Like, I was into hacker stuff. I knew people that were kind of into computers, but like there was kids in my middle school who were carding pagers at the time that like I just knew like other things, and they were like, they take your credit card, like send pagers to like some random house and pick them up. But yeah, like, they were like adjacent in the hacking scene. Like I was, somebody they're like, oh, like he's into computers, and I was like, years went by and like I somehow knew them just from passing. But it wasn't like we were like on some BBS or something talking to each other. It was just random kids I knew from middle school who were doing that back then.
Right.
It's just a really small world, and it's completely different now. Like so many people used to hack for like fun or whatever it was, and like the consequences were not what they are now. Now things have greatly shifted. So
yeah, it was a different scene, and yeah, it was actually similar for me. The people who I knew directly who got in trouble carding, it was same thing. It was just like kids that I knew at school that were like, and they were doing the same thing. That's what's so funny. They were carding stuff and having it dropped off at like a house that was nobody lived there or whatever. But okay, yeah. So it sounds like we've had a very similar experience in the early hacking scene. So then you go to computer repair shop, which is hilarious again, because that was my first professional job involving IT or computers as well, as fixing computers and re-imaging them and stuff like this. So that's cool. So then when you work your way up to the point where you kind of have done what you can do in that, when did you decide? Did you think at some point like, hey, wait a minute, I was in this hacking scene, I have this information, is there somehow I can use this? Did that kind of come to you later? Were you aware that there was even a career path there for a while, or was this just like, well, I get to work with computers? But were you even aware that there was an InfoSec path?
Yeah. So I going back to my guidance counselor and teachers, I used to show up and talk to them and tell them, "Hey, I'm going to hack computers for a living," and they'd be like, "Hey, maybe you should graduate high school first and like get out of here. Like you should worry about that." Oddly enough, my wife is now a guidance counselor, and she interned for my guidance counselor, who was my high school guidance counselor. So we've stayed in touch, and they've brought that up a couple times. They're like, Justin used to come in here and say he was going to hack, and we'd be like, no, no, no. Like, you got to graduate high school and just try to be like a normal human first. Like, this isn't going to happen for you. Like, we hope it does, but it's not going to happen. So I always carry that with me, and it's really funny. I did the system engineer thing during that time. I got like my CEH, OSCP. I became a network engineer, and I kind of got to a point where I'm going to either need to get my JNCIE, which is like Juniper's equivalent of like a CCIE or a CCIE, and kind of move up that path, or I need to make the jump to security now because I'm making decent money. And at the time in InfoSec, nobody would hire you without 1 day of experience. Once you had 1 day of experience, like everybody would give you a job. So I was applying places and just getting denied. They're like, you don't have any experience, like you don't know enough. I'm like, here's my OSCP, here's like things I've done, side projects. They're like, nope, nope, nope. So I got my lucky break with a company called Redspin out of Carpinteria, California. They gave me my first remote job. They gave me a break. And then it was kind of, like I said, once you have your first job and kind of like prove you've done a little bit of this, everybody was willing to hire you. So then I kind of jumped around every like 1 to 2 years, I think, from that point. I was at Redspin, Accuvant, SecureWorks, back to Optiv. I was at Fusion X for a little bit, and then I was at TrustedSec for about 9 years. I jumped from TrustedSec to Fusion X for like 3-4 months at one point, but then I came back to TrustedSec.
Yeah, I think I just saw. I think you posted on X just the other day that you hit your 9-year anniversary at TrustedSec, right?
Yeah. They all like to make fun of me because I left for a couple months. So they're like, your first anniversary or your second anniversary. But yeah, I've been here 9 years minus 3-4 months where I left for a little bit.
Yeah, it's like a sabbatical.
Yeah.
But I wanted to actually ask you about that because I wasn't aware of that time period where you said you kind of moved around every year or two, and being someplace for 9 years is sort of uncommon in this specific business. Maybe not uncommon within all of IT. There's plenty of people who stay at Microsoft and big name places for like 20 years and stuff like that. But I think more specifically within like red team, penetration testing, information security, I think that it's fairly uncommon, right? So that's, first of all, that's really cool that you found a place that you're happy to be at for almost 10 years now. But I just wanted to dig into that a bit. Is that just a matter of you were, I guess, given continued opportunity there, because it seems like a lot of times it could be difficult to continue to have new opportunities at a place after a while, right? So it feels like 9 years is like a very long time for that. But you still seem extremely engaged after 9 years at TrustedSec.
Yeah, I think I've been blessed because the company, so I just started at TrustedSec. I think I was like the 15th employee, 16th. We have something like 130 now. So, and I will say that prior to InfoSec, I did jump around every couple of years as well. And I think that in the beginning of InfoSec was largely a money thing because people you didn't have experience and people don't want to pay you. And then you ramp up really quick and then, kind of jump to the next thing. Here, basically Dave has had a lot of faith in me to kind of do, what I want and kind of run things in the directions I want. So I was able to, go from pen tester to kind of building out the red team, running that, building a research team and having that be a thing, which sounds easy nowadays because a lot of consulting firms have that. But trying to tell a bootstrapped consulting company that, doesn't take funding, hey, I want to build a team of people that don't make any money. Like they just do research. Like that's not what anybody wants to hear. And I was like, this is going to get harder. I'm like, we need to do this. We need to make the commitment. And there was some missteps along the way. Like we dragged our feet on doing it. And we've done it, and Dave's been super supportive, and it's kind of just I keep growing. I think for me, like iguanas are a good example. Like they'll grow to the size of the aquarium that they're in. I've been able to keep growing the company and staying interested in what I'm doing. I think that's a big reason for this. Also, I think a lot of people got out of offense several years back when it was easy. I think it's turned the tide back to being hard again. So I think you're starting to see people come back or be more interested in it. There was a time period where pen testing got kind of stale. You could do the same thing over and over. You could get DA before lunch. You could get in everything. And that was just a sign that defense wasn't there. I think now that's more challenging. I think it's easier to stick around for the long haul. I think that might change in a few years as the barrier to entry gets harder. But right now, I think it's still attractive for people to stay. And that's one of the reasons I've been into it, because it's been fun watching the genesis of things get harder to break into clients. Like the blue teams will say, hey, that was a really cool idea, but we caught you. Like, why don't you try this? Or, they're super collaborative. At one point it was, we're going to break in and the blue team hates you. They're like, oh, these these red team, we're going to burn down the infrastructure, and then we're just going to like yell at them on the call. And now it's like, hey, we're all here to learn. If we fail, you still learn something. If you fail, we learn something. Like, we work together. So I think it's kind of like it's a much better time. And I think that's one of the things that kept me around, because I watched some of my peers say, hey, like, this is getting boring. I'm going to go in-house somewhere. I'm going to go a different direction. And, I stuck it out because I figured that this was bound to happen. Like I saw EDR coming and SIMs and all those things. So I just think that there's going to be something in the next several years. Like, you can't forever make offensive engagements longer. The research lift keeps getting higher. So there'll be some, middle ground to reach. But I think it's an evolving landscape has kept me here.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I do remember that period where it just was like every network looked the same to me. It's like every test, I was like, here we go again. I could almost copy paste from the last report to the next one, but it certainly did change. I mean, I think it also depends too, right, on, and I guess this is changing, but it depends on the level of your client, right? Like, I know some people who still, they run penetration tests for, I'm guessing, small to medium sized clients, and they're just shredding them every week the way that I did to companies like 5 years ago, right? With all the same tooling and techniques and everything. But then at the same time, if you go and you have more mature clients who have, a pretty robust security stack, they have a pretty good, capable blue team. They maybe, write their own detections for in-house stuff and everything. That's a lot more interesting. That's a lot more difficult. And you can't do a lot of that stuff from years ago. And there's almost like an entirely separate methodology. And I think that a lot of times nowadays, that's why people want to separate the terms red team and pen test, because there is kind of this schism at this point, right? Between like a pen test against a small to medium sized client and a red team against a large client. They're going to look vastly different, right?
Yeah, I try to position pen testing for most people these days as, do you want coverage? You're like, hey, we're going to find all the ways in. We're going to make a bunch of noise. Yeah, we can be stealth at the beginning, but if we're ultimately going to give you coverage, here's 100 IPs, here's 40 ways to break in. Like, you have to make some noise to do that. Versus like the red teaming side is, do you care about detection and response? Like, let's focus on goals that impact the business with that side. And like you said, there's not a firm boundary right now because nobody's defined that. Everybody's kind of in a different place, but I try to split them like that these days. There's I hope somebody tries to push more of a framework at some point. I don't know if that universally applies though. We run into this thing where, so some small clients are very easy to breach. We run into small clients that are, say, 500 PCs. They have admin and maybe somebody who cares about security. They put MDE everywhere. They put MDI in. They do some basic hardening, and they're like harder to hack than some of the giant clients with attack surface. So we run in this weird thing where there's like this advantage to being small and caring about security. if you're all in on like the Microsoft stack or you're all in on some product, like you can still do pretty well. So we run into those every now and then that kind of trip up the model of like, well, you're 500 computers, you're never going to buy a 3-week red team. Like, what do we do for you to give value? So we do some stuff with assume breach and things like that too. It's just, like I said, everybody's in a unique place. I look at it as you have the spectrum of like no security and like super high security. And there's like two stakes that kind of show you like where our client base is. And I think everything just shifted to the right a little bit. Like, yeah, we still have some clients that are very immature, but the average posture of a client now is, you know, somewhere in that middle ground. And I think that'll just continue to shift as security gets baked into stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. And I think that the concern around ransomware and being the next people in the news has probably pushed that shift quite a bit over the last few years, right?
Yeah, ransomware is like a really big driver for, so like we'll have these companies that buy red teams and they'll be like, we want you to break into our DevOps pipeline and like push code to like all these machines around the world or something like that. And they're like, okay. And then like, what's the next goal? And they're like, okay, we want you to write a check from a payment system. Okay. Then they're like, at the end, they're like, hey, before you're done, can you like emulate ransomware, like going to all of our Windows machines over like PSExec and WMI to like run some code? And we're like, okay, the ones you asked for are like way up here and this is the floor, but everybody, I guess that just shows that everybody's concerned about it, right? Like that behavior should be stopped. I think it's burning the market a lot hotter than it should be right now. Like I think there was a big run up on like EDR investment from like outside funding and like growth in pen testing and stuff that was like an inorganic push because of ransomware. I think you're starting to see some of that fall back now. Like I think that it just pushed companies to invest in EDR and so much PE firms to invest in those companies so much that it was just kind of like an unnatural thing that couldn't be supported by it, which is why you're seeing like who are the big three in EDR now. Like it's, you know, CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, and MDE in the US. Yeah, there's some other ones, but it's very hard to be like an up and comer. That space is starting to consolidate more and more. You know, as those companies have telemetry, like that's the more telemetry you have is going to be your competitive advantage. So I think it pushed the market a lot faster than it needed to be. Now we're kind of seeing the results of that.
Yeah, it's sort of mimicking other markets in that way, right? Where you end up with 2 or 3 very large players. They have all the data now. They're getting more data daily than you have access to if you're a smaller company or a startup or something. So yeah, it's kind of does seem like a consolidation phase. But yeah, I do think it was driven by fear and of ransomware a lot. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of years, because I almost see, like you mentioned, I do feel like there's a pullback happening. And I feel like there's a greater pullback happening across the market just in terms of security spend. I think that, you know, companies are just restructuring. They want to put money into other stuff, namely AI. And right, everybody is like, if it's not AI, we're not hiring. And there's a lot of outsourcing of jobs. I saw just again the other day that Google, I think, laid off a lot of people, and then they're reopening the postings in other countries for the same jobs. And I feel like that's been a trend as well. So it just seems like there's a lot of effort to reduce spend. And I think that that's also happening to security. And I just wonder how that's going to work out over the next couple of years. And I'm sure it's affecting red teams and penetration testing organizations, because I know a lot of people that have been laid off from that are penetration testers or red teamers. And, you know, a lot of that, I think that some of those organizations just got too comfortable when like penetration testing was easier and it was easier to sell. And it was just like the money was flowing. And I think a lot of people got complacent about that. I think a lot of those orgs didn't do R&D and didn't continue to update their methodology, didn't continue to find ways to provide new value to their clients who maybe had been seeing the same reports for year after year, right? And so that's one of the things that I thought was so cool about TrustedSec and about your role there specifically was that TrustedSec continues to put out interesting information to the blog for red team and blue teams as well, and obviously has dedication to doing that R&D and putting that information out, sharing with the community. And I really saw that fall off at a lot of other firms over the years. And now it seems like you've proven your point where a lot of the firms who didn't do that stuff, they're the ones laying off big chunks of people now.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think the pen test market went away. I think, like I said, to your point, like I think they just lose clients and then it just ends up being like we need to make X level of profit per consultant. And then if a lot of those other companies are product companies as well. So they realize, hey, like this just doesn't work for us. Like we're giving away pen tests, but it's still not, the return's not there. So I think it's obviously that sort of thing's good for companies like us and Spectre Ops and Bishop Fox and all those other places, because now it's kind of consolidating into, there's this handful of firms that do a really good job. The work's still there because, like PCI requires pen testing. New security standards all the time require that sort of thing. Ransomware is driving it. So it was weird to see a consolidation, but to your point, like the research and the doing a good job piece I think was falling off for some places. The hardest thing for publishing research, I think, for us these days is we always had the ethos of publish everything. I probably was the driver here for pulling back on some of that, because you have to strike a balance between publishing a full tool, publishing a POC, or publishing like just a concept, and how many R&D cycles you want to spend to keep it valid. Like we're not trying to hold back knowledge and research, but if there's a particular tool that implements in a certain way and you plan to use that all the time, are you going to keep giving up R&D cycles to make it work once it's public? Maybe you're okay with it. Like there's lots of instances it works, right? But like Cobalt Strike, for example, great tool, great R&D, got so popular, and because of its own success kind of drove itself into the ground. Like, yeah, you can still make it work, but what's the cost to make it work on every engagement past EDR versus, buying a similar product like Nighthawk or writing something in-house? Like before it was just the go-to, hey, it works most of the time, a little bit of effort, but there's been so much focus on it that basically like shot themselves in the foot. And that's what we kind of run into now. Like we tend not to release POCs before there's one in the public. Like that's kind of a thing just because would like to keep the internet in one piece. Like, so that's kind of been and I think the industry's evolving around that a little bit too, but like just things like full implants. Cough Loader was part of some tooling that we had. So we released that bit. Initially we released a bunch of BOFs for situational awareness. Those BOFs only did recon. Once somebody else released a bunch of BOFs that did like third-party communications to like get services running on another box. We released a second set called Remote Ops. So we kind of just keep a pulse on the industry. If there's something out there that's similar, somebody's already released it, like we're not dropping a bunch of new and novel on people. If we ever get into the new and novel space, we'll release like a basic POC, not the full thing. And it's a shame the industry kind of got there, but it was always going to self-correct. Right? Once you could put a tool on GitHub and the EDR product had signatures in a week, 2 weeks, then you need to figure out what the balance is, because simply getting a shell on a workstation for a red team is like the starting point. It's the bare minimum. It's not like, even if a client works with us to allow list the EXE or whatever we're running, they care about everything that happens after that. So if I'm making my job to get the thing running extremely hard, like that's not helping anybody. Like the client still wants you to get something to run, wants post-exploitation. That's the balance these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because it's difficult. Because I mean, you want to release stuff and you want to help the industry, but like you said, clients want you to have stuff that's going to work. They don't want you to have a bunch of stuff they already have signatures for and it's going to get blocked. That's not going to be helpful for them. And you can't emulate threat actors who are using custom tooling and unknown tooling and everything with off-the-shelf stuff that is signatured heavily, right?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't.
Yeah, we get clients where they'll say like, "Oh, this previous vendor wasn't good. They couldn't get something running." And I'm like, that's not a great bar. Like, it's not a great measuring stick when people are like, "Oh, this client, it took them 2 days to get a payload running or whatever." It's like that's the kind of feedback we get from clients. Like, that's what they care about. But then you talk about like the rest of the testing they want, and it's all after that. So then it kind of made a whole market for paid tooling, right? Like you see macro pack and shellcode pack and shelter project and these things popping up because you can, or outflanks tools. You can outsource your R&D to some extent these days. So I was thinking that was going to keep smaller pen testing shops alive for longer, but kind of talked about it before, like the pullback you've seen. I figured you'd say, hey, like we can spend $100,000 a year on tooling. We don't need to hire somebody, which is for most organizations that's a good thing. Like it's a cost savings, and that'll give us the tooling we need to be successful for a few more years. However, I still think there's just that R&D requirement keeps going up, and even the tooling is not a perfect stopgap for the hiring clients.
Yeah. That's going to be interesting to watch. I've noticed the transition to like paid tooling. Maybe there's a free version out there, but then if you want the latest and greatest payloads, for example, then there's a paid service. I kind of like that model. At first, I wasn't sure about it when I think it was the team that puts out was it Crack Map Execute that I first
the Porchetta people.
Yeah, they were one of the first ones that I really noticed were using that model, and at first I wasn't sure about that, but given the state of the environment now, I kind of feel like it's necessary, and for the reason you said, to help out those firms that can't make the investment of having one or two dedicated R&D people that cost a lot of money, right? You can buy tooling for a lot less. So
yeah. I like these conversations because I'm always the guy on Twitter that was like, they're like, oh, he's the guy that always argues about OST. And I was like, well, this problem is self-solving, right? Like as EDR, Defender, EDR, all those things get better, you'll see less people publish. So you can get mad and argue that red teams are publishing stuff. That means that defense isn't where it needs to be yet. And I was like, so I was always like, hey, I'm in the middle ground on this. I just don't want other people dictating kind of the rules. My fear with the OST debate, knowing the inevitable thing was red teams and everybody pulling back on publishing, was, well, okay, cool, they're not publishing tools, but now they're publishing research. Like we should put a stop on that. Like we shouldn't, because it's the next thing. Like, right, nobody really puts out full and fledged tooling, but the next argument logically is, oh, you put out a paper on Kerberos or you put out a paper on ADCS. Like you could argue that unearthing those two techniques has caused more pain than, you write my first C2 framework and you put it on GitHub. Like, is that more impactful than the research paper on ADCS for like downstream, people getting breached? So that was my fear. Like I have no problem saying hold back on publishing a tool, a framework, a POC, but like I really make sure that there's a hard line there where I don't want people to say don't publish research, because defenders get a hold of me on a regular basis and say, hey, do you guys have a POC for this Palo Alto thing? Do you have a POC for the Citrix thing? Like we're trying to rate detections, but we need something more than just this basic trigger case. So there's definitely a market on the defense side to have access to the, offensive tooling as well. So I'm just trying to make sure that we don't end up at a place where nobody wants to publish anything and it's purely competitive advantage for research. Like, hey, TrustedSec is over here. They have some weird AD attack that, maybe bubbles up through like telemetry to, EDR companies, but like they're not sharing with this other company. So I'm trying to maintain that everybody still kind of pushes research, even if they hold back on like a full blown POC.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I saw, it's funny you say that because I'm trying to remember the exact case now, but I saw somebody get upset the other day about research, and that, and it wasn't even, the research in question, it didn't even provide like enough code or POC for, you'd have to have a capability already to make use of the research that they were upset about. And, I hadn't really considered that that's kind of the next inevitable point for that conversation or that argument. I thought we were past that. I remember, like we started there. And because when I first got into the hacking scene, it was all taboo. You weren't supposed to talk about how to hack things or how to break into things at all. And, that information, you had to seek it out in weird places, sort of, internet underground type places because it was like taboo. And, I thought that we already did this, I guess. It's like we went through this phase of trying to keep it crushed, keep it taboo. Then it's like companies accepted that this is a thing and that it's better to have more transparency, more testing, have a whole industry of people employed as professional hackers, ethical hackers. Like I thought we already did this, right? So I guess I'd be surprised if we go back all the way the other way at this point.
Yeah, we do this a lot with like the 0-day debate. Like, what's a 0-day now? Like when I grew up and came up, like a 0-day was an exploit that got passed around or a couple people had that the vendor wasn't aware, the public wasn't aware, like nobody was aware. Like there could be a 0-day in like WooFTP or some other service back then, and it could get abused for weeks, months, years. Now they're like, oh, well, it's a 0-day because there's a proof of concept and no patch. Well, like people are aware of it, like that. So that had shifted, and then the whole thing used to be with you'd be hitting refresh on like full disclosure mailing list on like a Friday, knowing somebody might drop something like King Cope or somebody would drop something on a Friday that's going to like wreck the internet. And that has changed a little bit more, but that was like, we've been there, done this, and then we're back around again. So it'll balance itself out eventually. Like I said, just the research piece is a big thing. I don't want to see go away. I think everybody forgets that, like, I don't think there's a single shop that could exist in the offensive space by itself in a vacuum. Like everybody has to play off of everybody, unless you somehow are going to acquire all the big consulting firms, keep them around and be a single source. Like we have to share. And then that gets into a whole separate issue of like, do we create a walled garden? So like you have a company, I have a company, we're going to share with each other. How do you deal with up and comers? How do you vet things? Something I've been focusing on lately is techniques and tooling that leaks or comes out because of like intel reports. So CTI folks all the time publish reports. They'll publish, here's an idea of a tool. So I'll take some time and I'll recreate the tool for our own purposes. But every now and then there's like 5% net new tradecraft or evasion that shakes out through that. So I think people forget that that's also a valid avenue to find things. I think you just have to be able to cut through the fluff in those reports. So you'll see things like somebody writes like a loader and some APT group uses it, and then they use like a separate file, maybe like a JPEG, to put the code they're going to load in, and people will be like, oh wow, they did Stego. Ooh, Stego's in this JPEG. Perhaps the reason that they use two files is because when something gets detonated in a sandbox or emulation, it doesn't pull both files in. So like you could say Stego is really cool, and maybe that was the reason, but I doubt they're trying to hide a picture of a chicken is like on the file share. It's not the big deal. It's the two. So being able to like look at tradecraft and say, hey, I can bring this back to life. I can recreate this, or I can modify it. A really good example that's like super specific to TrustedSec was there was a CVE for Outlook with Microsoft homepage. So there was you could set a homepage via like EWS and stuff like that. And it would cause your Outlook client to go and grab a homepage and could run some code. Microsoft patched it. The patch was a registry key. So for the longest time, we were using a macro at TrustedSec that would roll the registry key back, set the homepage value. We would push, it would then, Outlook was now our C2 basically to pull in some code and run stuff. So people were like, that's not super new and novel. Well, if you're a blue team, a macro setting an Office registry key, setting URL, not executing code initially, breaks up the normal execution chain. So that's what we look for these days. Like, can we roll back a patch? Can we roll back a registry key with something that is benign? And that's where you have to like really, like I call it necromancing TTPs, but like you can take a technique that might be burned because EDR has a really static detection for it, go do some research on the internet. Hexacorn has a really good blog of like a bajillion things you probably never thought of. Grab something from there, grab the TTP, and then recreate it. And you can probably find some way to make it, give it some legs again. So I think that level of creativity is is going to keep things alive. I think a lot of people will say, oh, we have MITRE coverage or this thing got completely burned, not realizing that, okay, cool. Like if I combine a little bit of something new, I can bring it back. That's some of the, like, I think the secret sauce that different companies make work now that doesn't get published. Like, hey, I've seen this, you've seen this, let's talk. We can make this thing happen again. That gets, I just think that really gets missed in the CTI reports, other things that happen. Like people are like, oh, they magically came up with this idea to get this to work. And you're like, no, this is like a couple years ago and this is new. They stitched them together and we're back in the game.
Right. Yeah, that's actually probably my favorite area of like exploit development, or writing offensive tooling right now for me personally is like I've taken techniques from stuff that Microsoft themselves put out on GitHub like 10 plus years ago, this like really old code snippets, and applied some different newer technique with it, and flies past EDR, right? No issues. And that's like my favorite. I love that when I get to do that, when I get to resurrect some old technique or some old code, and it works. And, until someone's looking for it very specifically, it'll keep working usually. Yeah. So I love doing that. That's like my favorite area of malware dev right now, personally. I'm usually, I don't really usually have the time personally to go and, I'm not going to find a new 0-day LPE for Windows newest version and keep chasing that. It's a lot better return on my time investment to modify existing techniques and patch stuff together to make it work and get around the very static detections that most EDRs have for stuff.
Yeah, I always look at these cycles of like Microsoft gives and takes. Like you see Microsoft kill off a bunch of like attack surface. And then I think the greatest gift to red teams from Microsoft was the way that they did domains on like the whole cloud side, right? Like, so you've been in this long enough where you used to register a domain, you'd categorize it, you'd have to keep some content on there, you'd age it. And then like somebody decided to gift everybody like, oh, you can put a website in front of SharePoint.com or a website in front of Azure websites. Oh, and just so you know, Microsoft actually uses Azure websites for documentation. I'm like, why would you let anybody control the front half of a domain that the top level is trusted? And I get that you can get a list from them now of like all the subdomains and IP space, but like, is there a big one? Every cloud provider out there that lets you
every CDN,
yeah.
Every CDN basically can be abused in the same way. I moved to using CDNs and cloud fronting basically everything like years ago, right? Where it just, because the difficulty in maintaining a domain to keep its rep high, and then you use it, it gets burned, and now that domain's gone. Compared to just spinning something up on Azure or AWS or Cloudflare or any number of CDN providers, you just get that inherent trust, right? Yeah. So that was a huge gift, and I don't see it being changed. I don't know if there's a plan to mitigate that, but it seems to be expanding still. It seems to be there's increasing options, so I don't know what's going to happen with that, but it has been a huge gift. I mean, that's like pretty standard for me now to utilize those.
So I'm not going to name them, but I have some friends at Microsoft that this is a weird debate internally, because you have, you read a red team report and you go do an outbrief, and then somebody would be like, hey, CISO, we used Microsoft for CDN. Microsoft sucks. They should fix this. Ha ha ha, Microsoft. Like, this is just a feature of Microsoft allowing people to do red teamy stuff. Like they're deeply aware of who does what and like what's going on. And internally, I know they've had some debates around, do they allow red teams or do they blatantly block all red teams? Like, what do they do? And I think the security people are like, we should keep these people around. We know who they are. We can monitor them. Lets us understand what's happening. And I think that puts them in a real tough spot. So I'm always very careful not to, as much as I joke about Microsoft gifting us this stuff, like Amazon's fairly supportive of red teams. Most cloud providers and CDNs are fine as long as you don't cloud front or domain front like actual clients and stuff like that. But I think there's definitely like a middle ground. I would hate to see them blatantly block red teams unless there was a situation where they could guarantee that threat actors weren't using it.
Right.
That's not a situation most places can, agree to. So I think the easier way is I'm hoping places let you register and say, hey, this is a red team tenant. We've had this happen before with our DNS provider we use for a lot of our pen testy stuff. People have reached out to them with a takedown. They said, hey, the domain you're trying to take down is part of a trusted, valid security consulting company. You may want to reach out to whoever your security provider is first and make sure it's not them. I think there's got to be a middle ground unless somebody sells security, which I don't think is happening this year. Maybe next year with AI, but who knows?
Doubtful.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a lot of optimism, but I think that with the AI side, I hesitate to say, but I'm going to say it. I almost feel like we're being gaslit a little bit about the intended benefit in the short term of AI and AI integration with existing companies and services, because I know that it's being touted that it's going to solve all these problems. But I think really it's being pushed for productivity and for cost efficiency and stuff like that. And I don't see it ready to solve security challenges. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of some of the stuff I've been looking at lately from various cloud providers and some of their AI driven tooling or assistance that I don't think is performing well. I'm not going to get into the details right now, but yeah, I don't think it's ready. I don't think it's there. And I think that there's a major problem still that is going to continue to be present where you got to have a human in the loop anyway. You got to verify this information. And I think that we're going to see cases here in the next couple of years of people not verifying that information and having big consequences, right? And I think there's going to be this blame game that, because of this AI agent, this breach happened, or it should have caught this and it didn't, or whatever, right? Like I can just see that already happening, because as soon as you you're going to give people an AI security service of some kind with probably a disclaimer that it can be wrong, but still you're providing a product and a service and people want it to work. And then if it doesn't and they end up losing a lot of money because they were trusting it, they're going to be upset. And I think that that's going to be a real problem. So I'm a little pessimistic right now on AI's ability to solve security challenges where it is right now. I'm sure in the future it's going to improve to the point that it's going to be, I think, more just a normal part of the security landscape. Like we'll get there. It's going to be a normal part of it for both offense and defense, I would argue. But it may have more benefits in the shorter term for defense, I guess, but we'll see. But yeah, I'm a little skeptical of its ability to solve challenges right now.
This is like ML. So like 10 years ago, you had like EDR providers saying like, we're going to solve malware with math. We're going to use ML. And then you got a bunch of people on our side saying, ML is garbage. This isn't going to solve things. And now today, ML works really good. It does what it says.
Yeah.
It classifies. That's why you see people language hopping, right? You see people use Go, or then they go to NIM because the corpus of data that it's trained on doesn't have, features from these languages.
Right.
And so you see that happening. It just took significantly longer than people thought it would. And I think you'll see the same thing with AI. Like I use GPT and stuff all the time for code. Like it's a godsend for whipping up Python POCs. But like the actual like explaining functions and things like that, yeah, it's great. I get a lot of calls each month from people that are like, hey, our whole business is going AI centric or whatever. And I'm like, what does that mean? They're like, we don't know. They're like, we need a plan to test this stuff. And I'm like, what are you testing? We couldn't tell you, but everybody from the top down, we're doing AI. And like, that's the position most companies are in right now. and I feel for them. And then they're like, at the end of the day, like, okay, well, what are you going to do? And it turns into like, well, we really just want to feed a bunch of manuals into some GPT and have it help people for support. And I was like, so at the end of the day, you're probably going to buy somebody's packaged product. Like, you're not in a position to like train your own model and do all this stuff. Like, yeah, there's West Coast companies and things like that will do that. But this is just going to be like a product for most companies at some point that has a nice wrapper. Like, you're not going to have to do this. It's sort of like like WordPress. Like, right, you could write the equivalent of WordPress on your own, but it's easier to buy WordPress and throw plugins and stuff in it. Not a perfect analogy, but like most places don't need to rewrite that. Like, if you want to do a blog or whatever, you add some plugins, you do a thing. I think you'll see a lot of companies end up in that space. I'm guessing nobody wants to miss the boat, right? Nobody wants to be, hey, we didn't do AI. And I think right now it's just a lot of, we're going to roll the dice and try things. And I don't know. We just get a lot of like AI testing questions. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, we can help you test an LLM or whatever you're doing. And they're like, oh, we don't have one yet. We're just making sure we have plans to do so. And then like OWASP has their LLM testing guide and everything. And there's just a lot of like, it's sort of like cloud testing several years ago. Like, originally when cloud came out, it was, I'm going to treat this like an external, like, here's the IPs, let me scan them. And everybody's like, what about the IAM? And what about the 100 other services plus that Amazon has? People are like, hey, we're not there yet. And then it'll get there, but I have never seen anything like this. I think most companies a few years back were like, we're going to do mobile, cloud, and security. And to your point from before, I think they pulled back on security and replaced security with AI. So now they're doing mobile, cloud, and AI, which is great. But we're also in the middle of this ransomware disaster that is not going anywhere in the next several years. And even when ransomware goes away, now you're into this whole like extortion thing where I don't think people realize it's not super hard to like get one user's credentials, make them do an MFA push, steal all their stuff from like OneDrive or whatever cloud share they have, and then just ransom that back. Like, that's not a really big, huge technical lift, but it's super impactful if you're a big company, right? You're a Fortune 100. That level of hack almost looks as bad as ransomware. Yeah, you're not down for days, but the media side is what hammers you on that. So I think as people get more secure, you'll see the full encryptions fall off, and you'll see, hey, we're going to steal these files. Yeah, it's a roll of the dice for a ransomware operator if you're going to pay for those files, but you only need a couple because the level of effort is much lower.
Yeah, I don't think ransomware is going anywhere for a while, right? It still seems highly effective, the people doing it and using it. And I think attribution is, I'm always very skeptical on attribution. And I think that's kind of the secret for these operators is the ransomware operators have a pretty good understanding that attribution is poor. And if they have decent operational security, there's a good chance that their actions will be attributed to them, right? That's what keeps it going. And then for them, it's a numbers game, right? They only need a couple people to pay. So yeah, I think that'll continue for a while. But yeah, I think the focus on AI, yeah, it is like cloud, right? Nobody knows what to do in a sense. And when I recall when I launched the cloud testing at SecureWorks when I was there, just out of a need, right? It was like, hey, clients are asking for it. We don't have a specific service or methodology. Help us out, right? And so I wrote methodology for it and everything. And then, but what would happen pretty much every single time I would get on the early call, it would be a client that's like, we want our whatever cloud environment tested. Okay, well, what exactly do you have? What exactly do you, and they have no idea. We know we have this cloud environment and we believe it needs to be tested. And that's like the extent of their understanding of the situation of what they need. And I would spend a lot of what I did was actually helping the client figure out what kind of testing should they be doing? What needs to be tested? What are the goals? How should we approach it? That was a lot of what I used to do. Now, I feel like companies have a better understanding when they come into a test like that. They have a better understanding of, okay, this is what we want. We're going to mimic dev access in this one environment. We want to make sure of these items that these things we believe to be true. We want to make sure they're true. And we want you to look over, basically it's like configuration, make sure that things work the way that we believe that they do. Right. And so that's evolved. And I do think we'll see the same thing with AI. Right now, yeah, I think people, I've been trying to make the distinction between testing the model itself, because for most people, it's not going to be your own model. It's going to be somebody else's model. It's going to be OpenAI or Microsoft, same thing, basically, but or something off AWS. They have Bedrock, and you can spin up a bunch of different models, or Claude or Gemini or something, right? So there's going to be these handful of models that most people are going to be using, similar to cloud, right? And it's the same providers, basically. And so you're probably just going to be using one of those models. But I do think that, refocusing from, hey, we're worried about the model, to, okay, well, how does it integrate with our services, right? And usually that's going to be done through some kind of integration with like API calls, and maybe you set up some wrapper and that sends information to this model and gets information back. But like, what, you have to have, say, a service that has broad enough permissions that this model can get access to the data that it needs to be useful. And then what are the protections around that, right? What if somebody gets access to whatever that service is? Do they just have, is that just the keys to the kingdom now for all of your data inside your whole environment, because you want the model to have access to all that data, right? So I think it is increasing attack surface in some ways, but I think doing so across the traditional security landscape in some sense. Like, we go right back to, I find myself going right back to like API testing when I look at this stuff deeply. So I think that's where we are right now. It feels impossible to say where that's headed. And I know that there are some firms doing more sophisticated AI attacks and research, and that stuff's like, I saw one that was really interesting. I was talking to John Miller actually recently. He was on the podcast about this one attack that it's like universal across like 80% of models that they tested against, right? It's a jailbreak prompt injection attack method that uses like appends data to the end of a query, and it's basically like they basically fuzzed these large language models and found these specific strings that you can append to a query and cause a jailbreak or prompt injection. And it's like universal across like all these models, right? And so that stuff is really interesting. But again, even if you wanted to weaponize that to attack a specific company, that's not the whole attack chain. It's like that gets you started, but you need to tie that into how they've integrated that model into their existing infrastructure and what the impact is of that, right? So yeah, I guess we're all still figuring it out is the point, right?
Yeah. Your cloud comment was funny too, because we kind of went through the same thing where, we got people calling us, we're in the cloud now, we want you to do a red team, because we know that we do red team on everything else, and like our cloud infrastructure needs to be red teamed. We talked to them, be like, what are you doing? Like, what do you got set up? Or like, have you guys done, like best practice hardening? And they're like, no, we just want a red team. And I was like, listen, if you crushed your network and started over in AD, what would you do first? They're like, well, we'd harden it and we'd do all these things. I was like, this is your do-over. Like, it's the one do-over you get in security with like a whole new platform. Just do the basics, pick CAS benchmark or whatever you want to pick, and harden Azure, harden AWS against that standard, set up logging, do all those things right, and then get stuff into it. And people are like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then you're like, you don't need to go to red teaming. You don't need to go to cloud pen testing. Like, you need to do the basics, and you should be thankful that you're starting here and you don't already have a disaster here. And that was a really tough conversation, I think, for clients to be like, you don't want to do the cool, shiny thing that worked on your on-prem network already, because here we are. So I've had to have that conversation a ton. And I think people really appreciate it when you're like, listen, it's a do-over. Start at the basics, do the basics, enjoy it, be happy that it's kind of more secure now. Like, we'll get you to red teaming if you need to be there, but like, I'm not trying to sell you something you don't need. I was like, I'll be brutally honest with you. And I kind of carry that with most of the times I talk to clients is like, I'll talk people out of red teams all the time, or I'll talk people out of testing that is so constrained they're going to get no value because I don't want them to waste money. Like, we have a whole breadth of services we could sell somebody if we wanted to. Like, maybe you should do purple teaming, or maybe your EDR should work before you do a red team. Like, I think that a lot of companies aren't as forward in their scoping, or just kind of driven by sales, where like sales always wants to sell something, but that might not be the right fit. So that's something I put a lot of time into, like talking to different clients and the other thing for me is, if I understand your problems as a client, I can carry that in back to the red team. Like, hey, where do you guys have the hardest time securing things? Like, what software sucks? And they'll be like, oh, this EDR is horrible because of X, Y, and Z. And I'll be like, okay, cool. Like, these are my experiences with other ones, but any more feedback you can give me helps. So I try to turn everything into a conversation with clients, even if it's unselling what they think or telling them, hey, you're wrong. 99% of clients appreciate that. Like, if we'll maybe have a disagreement on like approach, the number one thing that comes a lot of times is, how many consultants are on your red team? And I'll say, well, we prefer less for more time, because almost every company bills in people weeks, right? So I could put 2 consultants on it for 4 weeks, or 1 for 8. With your stealth in mind, 1 for 8 is going to give you more value. We still lean on the whole team. Our team does daily meetings, talks. We still have a research team that steps in. We'll pull from other places, but it's in your advantage to do this for longer. We'll have some clients be like, well, other vendors did this different way. And I was like, right, we've tried that. We've learned, like, this is our approach. Certainly, if it's really long, I'll give you more consultants, but this is just from experience. And some people hate that, some people love it, but we just have figured out what works for us and kind of push on clients probably a little bit harder than other places do when we're in some disagreement.
Yeah, I really like that though, because the worst experience for a tester, I think, is when a test isn't aligned with the client and with their needs, right? And usually what happened is that sales sold them something that they didn't need, shouldn't get yet. They're not ready for, or whatever, right? For some reason it doesn't align, and then you have to do the test anyway. If you're the tester, like, you look at it and you're like, this doesn't make sense for this this client, but now it's too late. It's been sold, it's been paid for, it's got to be delivered, and it can be very uncomfortable to do that as the tester. And a lot of times I would try to like rework the scope with the client, like during the test, to try to get them value, right? To try to get them something that they're going to be happy with. Cause I don't want to walk away from the test with like them not happy and me also unhappy. It's not good for anybody. So yeah, I got into that, trying to align. Once I moved up a little bit and had more involvement earlier in like the sales process, the scoping process, I really did also focus on, well, let's make sure that like you're getting the test that you need, first of all, and kind of dispel any illusions here so that we can make sure that it does align. So I really like that. And it sounds like you at TrustedSec are also paying attention to whether it's client feedback or things, how it works on your side. It sounds like you actually make adjustments, right? And this is another thing that I've seen some orgs not do. It's like, well, this is working, we're making money, don't touch anything, don't change anything, And that always really drove me crazy, because I always feel like we could do better, and we should try to do better. So I really like that. One thing I wanted to ask you that kind of fits in with that is, since you have this higher level view now as like a CTO, and you have a pretty large team that for a pen test shop, right? Have a pretty large team, and there's a lot of tests happening. You probably have some insight into general trends, especially in offensive security. So, I wanted to ask you kind of, what are the trends that you're seeing in this space over like the last year, and kind of where where do you see things trending now in terms of offensive security, and based on what you get to see?
So there's a couple. A longer term trend that this is going to make this ends up making people angry who do this, but like 10 years ago, red teams used to be, I'm going to walk in the door, I'm going to put a Dropbox on your network, run responder, get DA, log in everything, you're hacked. Good red team. There was no defenses, there was no detection. I've seen a trend away from physical. I've seen physical still be in play, but it's usually something people do after several iterations of red teaming now. I think people are getting more aligned with threat modeling, right? Like, is your risk me walking in off the street, doing something malicious to your computer systems, or is your physical risk like an actual insider, or me stealing a laptop out of a car because they went to the bar and left it? Like, those are more realistic than somebody breaking and plugging in a box and doing something. Yeah, you're going to like cite some defense contractor where that's in their threat model, but like most Fortune 100, somebody sitting in their basement in Russia sending you phishing emails is higher on the list. So I think what you're seeing is more aligned to CTI. The last couple of years, there will be a breach, MGM, like Okta, something like that. So like Okta, SMS phishing. As soon as that went public, we were getting calls. Hey, can you guys do SMS phishing? Like, yeah, we've been doing it for years. It's really effective. Good luck mitigating it. Like, the controls to mitigate SMS phishing are like really strong MFA, things like that. But it's not like you can't block it because it's usually personal phones. Or we'll get like MGM, can you call our help desk and password reset? That used to be really popular like 9-10 years ago, but people forgot about it. So I think you're seeing a really tight cycle around people being aware of what just happened to somebody else and then wanting to test it is a big piece that we didn't see before. And I think you're starting to see more of the used to get like a pen test or a red team, you get the report and the client would run off and fix it. You're seeing more of, can we do an assessment after this for a few days? We call it purple teaming. Other people call it different things, where you guys put hands on our SIM, our EDR, and write detections for like most of the report. I think a lot of executives and CISOs and things like that report back up would rather say, hey, we had a red team. We came in right afterwards. We wrote these detections. We now have 80% coverage for what they did in the report. The other 20% is things will mitigate over time, versus, hey, here's a red team report. We didn't do well. Here's 17 long-term projects that are going to fix all of this. You're seeing a much tighter loop into like the detection and response side of things to kind of show measured progress based on that, which you didn't see before. The pen test side, I think, like we talked about before, you're just seeing the lines blur. For all of our mature clients, I'm always drawing that line. Do you want coverage or do you want stealth? You can do a really short red team or a really short pen test where I make all the noise in the world and I'll find you every Tomcat, JBoss, Jenkins, every way I could potentially use, or I can go this other route. So I think you'll see people kind of scale back the pen test and kind of shift the money to assume breach, other things. You'll still spend probably the same, but you'll just kind of do areas of focus. And the last thing I'll say is we've been getting a lot of requests for assume breach from non-standard positions, right? So usually when people say assume breach, hopefully it's on a computer that isn't loaner laptop one, has your EDR stack, has everything on it. But we've had clients request, can you start from a network appliance? Can you start from a NetScaler? We'll put you on a Avanti appliance. We'll put you on a DMZ device. Things you probably should have been doing. And if you look at the last couple of years, it's kind of been a bloodbath of appliances. So starting from there and giving your IR and your defensive team a workout, most places are doing much better than they have in the past on workstation side. But, initial breaches are coming in different ways now. So we're kind of seeing a lot of pushing towards, we'll give you some cloud credentials and we'll give you MFA, assuming you could steal a token or something from some kind of machine. So more of those unique paths that are kind of aligned to what's happening in the wild. Those are probably the big three.
Yeah, I definitely have seen the shift in the follow-up to the red team reports, like you said, where people want to know that detections were made. Like after this report, it's like, okay, what detections did we create based off this? How much coverage do we have on this? I think also there's been, along that same line, a lot of requests that I've gotten in the last year and a half are around like retesting detections in a sense. They want to know, do our detections still work? Or, a lot of this too is, I think, because of migrations to the cloud or from one cloud provider to another, or you've changed some tool in your security stack. So this all kind of ties into other stuff that we talked about with like the pullback on security spending, or the getting into the cloud for cost savings, which I don't think has worked out for most people, but that was the pitch. um, so it's like you change these variables in your environment, and now people are waking up to the fact that, like, wait a minute, our detections maybe don't work now because we've changed these other factors, and they want somebody to come in and do testing for the explicit purpose of verifying that the detections they think they have still work, are going to fire, are going to be noticed, are going to feed into whatever tool and bubble up somewhere, right? And so, yeah, I definitely have noticed the same thing, a trend towards detection, either creation or verification focused testing efforts. And I mean, it makes sense, right?
Yeah, we do this. So we had, as you kind of talked about, like adapting services, like we initially used our red team to do our purple teams, and then realized that we red team the same clients year over year, so they can't write the detections because they would realize what they did, and that was kind of a bias thing. So we split that team off. And one of the things we did that is somewhat unique, which I guess isn't novel to everybody now, but like you get a lot of purple team reports where they'd be like, we wrote this detection, but you don't ingest 4688s. So you can't do command line logging, and these detections don't work, but you should do that. We'll say, hey, do you have an EDR product that you can write custom detections in? Okay, CrowdStrike or whatever gets this event log in its own format. We can write the detections there. So I think not forcing clients to say you need to log every event if you have some other control or some other detection tool where you can write similar alerts in is a big thing. I think people are starting to understand more now. And I have this weird prediction that I think that most clients don't want to be in the business of running a SIM. And I hate like EDR, XDR buzzwords, but I think a lot of clients want to be in a place where they have some magic XDR that you ship logs to, that somebody mostly manages. They can write some custom stuff, but like people really don't want to be like in the business of running some giant Splunk instance. Yeah, you have to collect logs for like admin reasons, but on the security side, the iteration loop for detections from your EDR is much quicker now. How many custom detections are you writing? Yeah, you're going to write some specific to your environment, but like you should be able to do that over here without having to do all the infrastructure around it. I think you're going to see people pulling away from SIMs long term. And even if, I guess I use SIM lightly, on-prem SIM for something that somebody else mostly manages in the cloud that you ship logs to, I think is going to be the next thing.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen that shift as well. Yeah, I mean it, and it makes sense, I think, but it can be difficult still, because then if you decide to change who you're shipping that stuff to, maybe it changes your detections, or if you decide you're using Falcon and you're writing detections for Falcon, and then somebody maybe on high decides we're not using Falcon anymore, we're going to switch to this other thing. It's like, are all my detections that we wrote over the last 3 years gone? Are we going to redo all that work? Right. So that could be a potential pitfall with that as well, that you could run into. But yeah, but definitely the point is kind of that the shift has focused, where I used to give out these red team reports, and I'd have the same clients year after year a lot of time, because they like me. Hey, he did a good job. He communicated to us during the test and everything was great. We want to use him again. So I get the same clients back, and I would get frustrated sometimes, because I would be writing the report and I'd be like, this seems familiar, and I go pull, from the archive, or ask them and look at the old report. And I'm like, it's exactly the same thing, I did last year. Like, why didn't you guys, gals, why didn't your team make this change? I don't, why did you even come back and ask me for another test?
Right.
If you didn't fix this stuff, why are we doing this again? And I have seen a dramatic change from that to now it's much more serious, where it's like, I don't want to just know what's wrong. I want to talk about how to fix it. I want to talk about how to get detections made for it. I want to make sure those detections work. I want to have you come back and test my detection that we just made. I want to make sure it works. Right. So there's this much better follow up, I feel like, follow up actions from clients, and on the blue team side, on the, where they're actually addressing the things in the report, and holding either, unfortunately, I think a lot of times what it comes down to is not just creating detections, but a lot of times holding service teams accountable. And I know it generates work for them, so I'm sorry, but there's a lot more sense of holding people accountable and making sure things do get fixed and don't linger from year to year to year, which I think was a real problem years ago when I was doing penetration testing. It's like year 3, I'm seeing the same exact stuff. It's like, what are we doing? That doesn't really happen to me at this point anymore. And maybe part of it is because my clients are more mature, as I've kind of moved up in the industry as well. But I feel like it's an overall trend across the industry.
We fixed that in a weird way, or one way that helped a lot was, most consulting companies will be like, we'll give you 1 or 2 report readouts, like an executive and a full technical. One of the things that we've done, and this isn't like some super secret thing, it's actually kind of obvious, but we said, hey, we'll have as many outbrief phone calls as you want. It tends that on a big outbrief phone call, say that we like are on-prem and the AD is not bad, but cloud has a lot of issues. The cloud team might not want to ask a bunch of questions on the technical side with that larger group. So we always tell clients, we'll do breakout phone calls with those specific groups that are affected, as many as you want, as short, long, 15, 20 minutes, so they can hammer us on questions and we can go back and forth. And I think that's one of the things that went a really long way in helping clients, just because been doing this so long, like nobody wants to be like, oh, the CISO's on the phone during the readout, be like, yeah, we really screwed that thing up. Like, some cultures are fine. Like, some companies are great and they can do that. But a lot of places like, hey, we'll talk to 4 or 5 devs and explain why server-side request forgery is bad and talk them through it. But so that has gone a really long way in mitigating a lot of lingering issues, I think, with our clients, which is, let us know. We'll have as many phone calls as you want. Like, we'll always hop on the phone. Don't be embarrassed. Bring 1, 2 people, bring everybody. But that's something we've done, and most people are pretty good about it.
Yeah, I like the idea of breakout calls with technical teams and individual contributors, because one of the things that I noticed, especially with Purple Team, was that it was important to get those technical contributors in a meeting away from high level management. If you really want to fix these things, I really advocate for that. I really advocate for having a separate discussion with just the people who are in the trenches, so to speak, right? The people that are going to write the detections or, alert, take action based on detection, like the people doing the work. I think you need to get those people in a room separately to talk through the challenges they face, to talk through some of the pitfalls, things that they know about that, again, like you said, they may not want to talk about when the CISO's on the call.
You made me think about one more thing. We were talking about pen testing. I think the biggest downfall of pen testing was not giving people AD credentials to start. And I know that's like a touchy point, but like, since most actual breaches start from a point of a basic user, like there's so many relay and like responder and LLM&R stuff like that is just solely focused on getting a computer level account or an AD user level account that gets so much focus from people fixing the problems that they kind of get that in this fog of like, this actually doesn't matter. Like, maybe you should run Bloodhound and fix the curve roasting and AD stuff first. People focus on that. And I think it just kind of, that's how pen testing always was. It never made that evolution that really, like, you're testing, almost everybody breaking your network is going to have some level of computer level or AD level access, assuming it's an AD environment. But I think that's just something that did pen testing a great disservice. And I could see people argue like, or I've even had this before. We allowed you on our network, so every finding should be lower because we put the blocked in. And I was like, I get it. Like, I understand that. We're here to help you. Like, if internally you want to lower them all, perfect. But like, we're a third party. So I think that it's kind of got to a point where like everybody realizes that ransomware is generally AD centric. unless it's going after like VMware. Give us a basic user account. Sure, we can still do responder and those things, but like the real attacks and the things you should be protecting against are like what somebody can do from a basic user level workstation, is what most people face as a threat.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I recall around the time that I was starting to think that way and think like, why are we burning cycles? Basically, why am I burning time you've paid for also to try to get this first credential when you should be caring about everything after that? And you're probably not going to stop me from getting this first credential anyway. So why don't we focus beyond that? And I remember, I think it was Spectre Ops put out a blog piece about rethinking about the way that we approach red teaming and penetration testing and trying to have the conversation with clients to try to get them into this headspace about it's better for you actually if we skip that part, if we do assume breach, assume compromise, and let us focus, on the things that you actually need to mitigate. So I feel like that's been shifting. I don't know if it's still, I don't know how many clients are still reacting like, oh, well, we gave you access, so this, none of this matters. I've definitely had those conversations and arguments in the past, but I feel like it's shifting to a better place. I hope so. I hope we're not still having to have those conversations all the time with clients to explain to them that you're never gonna completely stop the initial intrusion, right? I mean, it's kind of a fool's errand to think that to focus on that, because it's like you're focusing so much on that, you're never going to stop it. And you could have been putting cycles into focusing on post exploitation and at least finding who's already in your network.
I have a love hate with so the thing you're talking about with Spectre, their blog post was about rethinking phishing. I completely agree with the paper, right? It says, hey, if you care about post exploitation or you care about phishing, what are we trying to test? Are we trying to test initial access? Are we trying to test the users? What are we trying to test? So focus it down to that. What I've seen come from not them, but a general shift is like companies like, 10 years ago, I could send several phishing campaigns in a day for RCE. Today, maybe it takes me a day or two to build everything. I understand skipping phishing with some clients as it's a big time effort if they don't care. Where I run into problems with people is going, let's just do assume breach. We still get into clients externally through OSINT and just external web apps where people would skip to assume breach and say like, oh, we've already done a good enough job. A really big area, it's because you get people saying, okay, we're not going to do phishing, skip external. And I'll be like, well, we can still do OSINT and credential spray. And they're like, you're not going to get in like that. And I was like, something that happens a lot is you're a decent sized company. You have a bunch of web apps that are published to the internet. They're not tied to your IAM provider. You let third parties on them. I pull breach information. I cred spray some web app that you've only ever tested from the login portal because you've never given anybody creds. I find some breach stuff. I get in. Now it's like I can get access to that box and get code execution fairly easily because it's never been tested, but nobody, everybody called a login page and moved on. Like that's a really, really common scenario, as well as finding like NTLM auth or something weird, or like getting into an MDM. We've had a good run with this where we've got into like MDMs because they're not usually multi-factor because of just the way they're configured. And you could put like a VPN client on like a iPad, and then you can bridge the connection and get into their network with that. Like there's a lot of scenarios that are realistic and out there that aren't off the table. So I completely agree with saying, hey, we're going to skip social engineering for this engagement. I would still spend a little bit of time on OSINT external because those things aren't fixed. Like most of the breaches that come out are like, oh, we missed MFA here, or there was this weird problem. Yeah, we're really mature in these other areas. So that's just my word of advice. Like I'm completely behind like the days of fish 500 users for RCE are just gone because you can't do it at that scale. Okay, what do you care about? Well, we care about gaps in our EDR and our GPOs for file types that can run. Okay, send me a laptop, give me an email account. I'll try to detonate payloads for 2 weeks or a week or whatever it is. Like, let's narrow it down to what you're trying to answer as a question. It's the same thing with phishing. Like, probably some payload we can get you to run, but is a user clicking the link sufficient to like at least prove that piece out? So I think just asking and answering the question is what is happening. Whenever somebody says like, go straight to assume breach, skip it, I always cringe because we've got in enough externally where I'm like, are you sure? And they're like, yeah. And then this used to happen more often where I would be on a scoping call with a client. I'd be on GitHub during the call and I'd be like, hey, look in chat. And they'd be like, what's that? I'd be like, yeah, I just pulled that out of GitHub. And they'd be like, oh, well, you guys are hired. And I'd be like, okay, cool. But you probably want to rotate this before we start. So that was a really common occurrence for several years.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that something I was thinking about along these same lines was with the push to go to passkeys and get away from passwords. I could see where a focus on external could make a big comeback in a sense. Especially, I guess I expect research on the offensive side to increase on external again. As maybe as passkeys are implemented or whatever, the passwords, the ideas of like password spraying or getting a hold of a credential kind of go away. If that does happen, I would expect a lot more external research and a focus on that, I guess. There's always ways into initial access methods into a network. There's a million, but I'm very interested to see if that kind of provides a resurgence into external. And we're already seeing a lot of stuff with appliances, right? So that's still there. But I feel like I don't read about as many external, RCEs and stuff like that as I used to, besides the appliance.
Right. Yeah. Web app testing's tough on red teams because if you do a good enough job trying to relay off of Amazon or whoever it might be, and you're kind of targeted and they have some detections, then it turns into, wow, we saw some weird stuff that wasn't the usual thing. There must be a red team going on. And then like they jump into that mode, which is like a really tough position because there's this like weird rift between like the bug bounty people and the red team people because they're like, oh, the bug bounty people like red teams can't do web apps. And I'm like, if I ran your bug bounty methodology on a lot of these clients, they'd be like, oh, there's something going on. Like it's that time of the year, there must be a red team.
Right.
But trying to account for that and like do the level of diligence, like I have nothing but respect for the bug bounty people because they come up with great things. But I always try to find a way to like, I need your methodology, but like with some care about getting caught to the point of them being like, there's something going on I need to be aware of. Because you probably know as much as I do. If they know there's a red team going on, a lot of times blue teams start responding to like informational level alerts. They're like, oh, we noticed this person wrote an LNK to their desktop. We're like, that was it? There was nothing, but it was like benign. They're like, yeah, but we saw an informal alert. We're like, do you follow up on these all the time? And we're like, not a chance. Or like, be honest with yourself because you'll actually get the staffing levels you want. Like it's not I don't see this as much anymore, but that used to be a big thing where they'd be like, yeah, we worked back on this one event and we're like, I'm pretty sure Bob going to like some website once wasn't the thing that you sit there and do all day.
Yeah, I've definitely had that happen for sure, where I'm like, come on, there's no way that you're following up on this on a regular basis, and it's pretty obvious that they were aware that there was a test happening and they were on high alert, and checking every single thing, trying to hunt down the red team. But it's another one of those things that's evolved, and I feel like it's better than it used to be in most cases. But one thing that I wanted to ask you about that's important to me personally is we're kind of in the same age group, and I see a lot of people. I'm still very hands on. I do a lot of research. I do malware development. I'm write tons of code and all this, and I do a lot of unique research still. I've experimented with management a couple times in my career, and each time I kind of been like, I don't want to come off the hands on keyboard. I want to keep doing research and exploit development and all this. So I kind of come back to red teamer, and so one thing I think about is I see people take a manager position for a little while and their skill just drops off after a year or two, where they're not keeping up with it, right? And so I know that for you have a good position, unique position where you still do research. I've seen you put out research. It seems to be something that's important to you. You've said that, it's important to you that it's like you get like a balance and all that. But just overall, this idea of like aging out, right? because I already sometimes feel like an old man in this business when I see a lot of the stuff coming out from people who are between like 16 and 22, right? And so I do ask myself sometimes, like, man, how long can I stay super sharp on research and all this? How long can I stay motivated? And that's really the part I wanted to ask you was like, how do you stay motivated after so long in the business? You've seen all the things, and I mentioned earlier when I was testing back to back to back, I reached a point kind of burnout where I'm like, every network looks the same. So, what keeps you motivated to stay hands on keyboard to keep doing research when, let's be honest, you could just stop doing that part probably and be equally successful from a business perspective personally, right?
Yeah. So I still do a couple pen tests a year. I still hop into red teams to help. I don't run red teams because the time commitment just to be there isn't enough. The pen test is easier. I can dedicate a week or two and do those. So I look at myself as a funnel for a lot of things at TrustedSec. Like I have an obsession with this space. Obviously, if you know me, you see me on Twitter all the time. Like I tend to love to ingest CTI reports and things like that. And I got to a point where I know enough people at work that I can hand things off when I know it's above me. But I don't know. I've just managed to maintain a balance, and they've been supportive here. If I couldn't do the technical side, I wouldn't do this. I would do something else. Like the biggest fear for me is like in management, you make enough salary and you get to a point where like, cool, you're really valuable to one organization. What is your value anywhere else? And I've been like, I intend to stay at TrustedSec, but what, somebody could offer me a job making double tomorrow and it was the perfect thing, right? So I've always tried to keep my technical skills up, mainly because I had always, jumped around in the past. Like I'm happy with where I am, and it's just, I get burnt out from time to time. So I usually watch like Hackers a bunch of times because I grew up watching that, and I kind of take a break. The other thing that helped me, and I always preach this, is like get hobbies outside of this space. So I'm really big into like drag racing. So I'll build and tune race cars. I'll help people at the track with them. Now all those cars are computer controlled, so it's kind of like adjacent. So I usually maintain a good balance that way. I don't know. Everybody goes through this weird arc, right? Like in your 20s, maybe you're single, maybe you have a girlfriend, maybe you're starting a family, whatever it is. You have your foot on the gas. You probably burn way too much of the candle on InfoSec. I did this. It hurt my relationship with my wife. It hurt like time away from my family. Like I'm grateful for where I am now because of it. But in retrospect, I wouldn't have done that. Maybe that's the hustle that lots of people need to make. Like whatever works. Like that got me to where I needed. I've pulled back to find like a more healthier balance now. But I still do this a couple hours a night, every night when I'm away, after work. So I found something that works for me. And then I made sure that I can kind of maintain healthy relationships outside of this. Like, this is not super for everybody, but like I make sure I still do date nights with my wife. I make sure that I go take time to do things like training my dogs is like something I do on the side. So I carve out time to do these other things where like, if I wasn't thinking about it, I could easily just say, I'll sit here till 10 o'clock at night and grind on the computer. So I think it's realizing you worked really hard to get to the place you wanted to be. Now, can you pull back and find a balance? I think you get a lot of people in this space that are so used to getting to where they want to be. They get there and they're like, well, now what? Like, I'm not happy where I'm at. And you're like, why aren't you happy? And they're like, this job uses black pens instead of blue. And you're like, hold on. 10 years ago, your boss was horrible. You made horrible money. Everything sucked. Now you're like, what can I find to be mad about at this place? And it's like something benign. And you really have to take stock of where you were, all the rest of the things in your life. And I've just done a decent job doing that. Like, I'm not perfect. I'll still go through periods of where I'm like, man, I am just burnt out. What works now is that I get to make a lot of my own schedule. So I may take 2 days and go, I'm going to go research this Palo Alto bug for 2 days. I still take some sales calls, but I kind of back everything on the calendar off. So those kind of like refresh moments are the things that like keep me going. So I think it's really just find, a healthy balance in your life for your relationships with your friends and family and your hobbies, and just commit to those. Cause it's really easy. We're all kind of have personalities where I gave you something cool, you'd sit up till 4 a.m. jamming away on it. But your wife might hate you a little bit. She might not say anything because she realizes, right, that's who you are. But you can only do that for so long before like somebody resents somebody. There's something going on. So it's just you got to strike the balance for yourself.
Yeah, that's something that I definitely struggled with in the past. I still struggle with it, but I do a better job now than in the past for sure. Yeah, it's kind of like the old hacker stereotype. It's like been up for 24 hours, no shower, hair nappy, like not ready to see the sunlight. Yeah, there's a reason, I guess, why that stereotype exists, right? There's a lot of truth in there. So it can be difficult to prioritize other things. And it is very difficult for me. I mean, still, like I said, but I definitely do a better job. But yeah, I definitely appreciate that perspective. I've been wanting to ask though, on your racing, you're trying to get a car ready for this season, right? What kind of car is it?
Yeah, so I have an '86 Mustang. So it's basically just a shell of what it was. So it's got a 427 GM LS motor. It's got a very big turbocharger. It should make about a little over 2,000 horsepower. So it's yeah. So there's
wow.
I'll do a lot of work myself. What I won't do is the roll cage work and the safety work.
Yeah.
So somebody who actually like I can weld two pipes together, right? But like, do I want to take a crash at 200 miles an hour? Maybe not. So my car's been at a chassis shop that my friend owns for about a year and a half now. It's there longer than it's supposed to be, but I told him to take last summer off because I broke my arm and couldn't race anyways. So it should be done in the next couple months here. But cool. I have enough friends with race cars that I can drive their cars. I can tune on their cars. So it's a group of people I grew up with for the last 20 years that we raced together with. So there's enough stuff to keep me busy and keep me away. It sucks not racing, but it was kind of time to take the car back down to nothing, put a bunch of roll cage and a bunch of safety stuff in it, because the last thing I want to do is get hurt if my fun hobby. So just going over all the safety.
Awesome. Yeah, very cool. That's so that 86 would have been a 5.0 when it was originally 5.0.
Well, it would have been a 5.0 if it was a GT. So it was an 86 LX. So it was originally a 4-cylinder car.
Gotcha.
So it long story short, I had always been in cars. I had different Firebirds and Camaros. Previous to this Mustang, I had a 2008 Corvette with a supercharger that made like 700 horsepower. All my friends got back into drag racing. They're like, you should get rid of the Corvette, build another drag car. So I bought a Mustang. It was ready to go. The person I got it from didn't do the best job, and it was just problem after problem. So I was like, you know what? Take the whole thing apart and start over. So we put a GM motor in it. We put fuel injection in it. And that went 520 in the 8th mile, which is like a low 8 in the quarter. And I used to drive it to and from the track. So that was a big thing for me. Drive to the track, beat people who trailered their cars there, and then drive home through the drive, go through the drive-through, get some French fries, whatever on the way back. So my car wasn't supposed to go faster than 550 in the 8th or 850 with the safety equipment it had, but the track's a little lenient. So now it's getting the full treatment, and it will probably go low 4s, which is like a 6-second quarter mile, basically because of technology these days. So I graduated high school around the 2000s, early 2000s. Fast and Furious just came out, and people were like, you owe me a 10-second car. Like 10-second car was fast back then. Like the first time I took this car to the track after I built it, it went like a mid-low 9-second, like first couple of times. Like, so cars, because of computers and turbochargers and a lot of stuff, have come such a way now that you can build a 6-7 second car and drive it to the track. I think people have lost some respect for how fast that is, because you can accidentally go that fast. But that's kind of why you got to be cognizant of safety. Like, you're pulling a couple of G's and you're going, 150 miles an hour in the 8th mile. Like, you probably want to make sure if you hit a wall, you're going to be okay.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah, good to have hobbies. Very cool. I can see where cars, would translate well for somebody with kind of an engineering brain, right? So that makes sense. But yeah, I've been out of it for a little while. I haven't been into racing for a long time, and just like like you said, the numbers have changed. You know, that's a lot more horsepower. That's a lot faster than 15 years ago. The kind of numbers I was used to discussing and seeing. So that's very interesting. I was not aware that you could pack 2,000 horse into that car and get down to like a six, somewhere
Yeah.
in the six.
Yeah, you can do a lot now. Like I think things change because like right, you can buy an Ultima now that runs like a 13, 14 and a quarter mile, right? Like in fact, 20 years ago that was moving. And it's not so easy to make horsepower now that and I think that there's a big piece of this where like I excel at because I look at data really well. So I have sensors on my car that log everything from like the shock position, so how much the shock raises, to like I have a G sensor, so it does X, Y, Z axis, pitch, roll, yaw. We look at drive shaft speed. So I look at all of these sensors after a run, and I can say, hey, like I'm spinning here, I'm not spinning here. I can add more power. The suspension is topped out because everything that I do is also on a very small tire. So we race on like a 28, which is like a 275 wide tire. So that's not like a giant drag racing, like a top fuel car. So we do a lot there. So it's all very, very data centric, data driven. Like there's a bajillion sensors on my car, and you got to be able to interpret that because there's a lot of old school people who are afraid of computers who can't look at all that data and make sense of it. But because of, kind of where I sit and what I do, I can look at all that really quickly and be like, hey, this is clearly a problem. There's some mechanical engineering side because you deal with like suspension, but being able to combine all that together has been like a godsend for me just because of the hacking past.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I hadn't even considered that, but that makes perfect sense when you can put sensors on there and discern what's happening. Very cool. So real quick, for people who don't know, you're obviously on X, Twitter. So, and your handle there, is it just at your name?
Hacking Elze, at Hacking Elze.
Hacking Elze, right. Okay. And is there anywhere else besides like TrustedSec has a blog? Obviously, I mentioned it earlier. Is there anywhere else for people to follow your research?
No, I'm really just on Twitter these days. I've been playing with LinkedIn a little bit because for some reason all of the EDR bypass people are now posting on LinkedIn instead. So I've been dabbling there, but I'm mostly just on X 24/7.
I wonder if they're trying to get exploit dev jobs or something.
Yeah, I don't know. It's super weird. Like the people just be like, "Oh, it's EDR bypass," and we didn't talk about this whole thing, but we're like, "Oh, well, it worked on CrowdStrike, but the internet was disconnected and the sensor was 2 years old." Like, come on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole discussion there because I did a lot of testing against really sophisticated clients with impressive tech stacks, and what I found was that it's not even like, well, I know this works against Falcon. It's like, okay, in what environment? It's very client environment. It can be very client environment specific, right? Different policies can be applied to the agent. I understand people not wanting to hook it up to the internet so it doesn't send that telemetry back, but again, it's not a true representation. And you may think that it works, but then you take it up against a real client with a real environment, and it gets prevented, or you get busted. They notice you. So, I've noticed that trend as well. And there's it's a whole topic for me that I could drill into because I have a lot of experience in the area, and I tend to think that most red teamers, even people putting out proof of concept code or EDR bypasses, don't actually understand how EDR works almost at all, and definitely don't have a very good understanding of it. And I think that when you do have a advanced understanding of how the EDR actually works, the way that you get around it looks a lot different, right? And so, it's that's a whole topic for discussion.
We'll have to watch that one another time. That's definitely a long form thing.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe that's one that we'll have you back to dig into more, because that's a topic of special interest for me, and there's a lot of stuff to get into there, and something I've been thinking about talking about because it's just such a lack of knowledge, it seems like, on the red team and exploit dev side on how EDR actually works. But I've had you long enough today. I think I appreciate you coming. Again, TrustedSec, I want to thank you and TrustedSec for the information sharing and the stuff that you do put out. I think you guys are doing great work. And I'll be happy to continue to check in and see what comes out.
Thanks for having me. Good time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
To an end, to an end, to an end.